I have a story that's a variant of a Nasruddin story. You know Nasruddin, the holy man who lived many hundreds of years ago. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of very short stories about Nasruddin. Some of them will make you smile. Some of them will make you laugh. Some will make you scratch your head and puzzle. Now, I don't know if that story about Nasruddin was true or not, but my story is. Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All I need is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. I like a vegetable garden. I always have. These days, I don't really have a garden, just a few tomato plants that I plug into the ground, and some herbs. But back in the day, as folks like to say, I had a garden. It was so big that I went out and bought one of those shiny red Troy-built rototillers. Troy-built, so named because they were built in Troy, New York. And every spring I would till up the ground and then grow row after row after row of peas and beans and tomatoes and squash and peppers. And sometimes I'd experiment. One year, I grew Swiss chard. Oh, it grew well. But the kids didn't like it. The next year, kale. Yeah, the kids didn't like that either. Now, I liked everything about the garden, all the hard work and the harvesting, the planting, the harvesting. But there was one thing that I never liked. I've always hated the weeding. I found weeding to be boring, tiresome, never-ending, tedious. Now, I remember one year when I was on my hands and knees in the pepper row of the garden. And that was a year that the peppers weren't doing well. Now, that happens sometimes in a garden. One year, the peppers they grow well and they're beautiful and bounteous, and the next year, not so good. Well, that's what happened this year. They were growing, but they were thin. Just this side of sickly. Anyway, I was weeding, creeping down the row, when I grabbed a weed and I pulled and then I yanked it out of the ground. I looked at the weed. The stem felt as strong as an oak tree. The top of that plant, the leaves were lustrous green, robust. And then I looked at the roots. The roots looked like Medusa's hair. I looked at the weed. I looked at the peppers. I looked at the weed. I looked at the peppers. I shook my head. And then I looked up to the clouds above me. Hey, up there, down here, it's Ken. I just want to say that, well, if I were you, I would have switched things around. I would have made the pepper grow like the weed, and the weed grow like the pepper. That's what I would do if I were you. Now, later that summer, mid-August, I went away for a couple of weeks. And when I left, the garden looked good. The day of my return, I walked out to the garden and I stopped short. What the? The vegetables had grown, but the weeds, they completely took over the garden. And I looked at one of those big weeds. I know what happened. Yeah, the day I left, you poked your head out of the ground, looked around, saw I was gone, and then you began to sing. Celebrate good times, come on, ba 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 bum 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 ba 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 bum. And then all of your friends came out and you celebrated. Celebrate good times. Come on. Bum, 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 bum. Yep. I was convinced that they all celebrated with that song made popular by Kool and the Gang. If you've ever been to a wedding in the 80s and even into the 90s, you know that song. Well, I stood there and I just shook my head. And then I looked up again to the clouds above me. Hello, hey, down here, it's Ken. I know you only had 7 days to finish everything. But if you could have taken just a second or two to switch things around. I mean, aren't we made in your image? Don't you want us to be healthy and strong? Wouldn't it be great if all these vegetables grew like the weeds and the weeds grew like the vegetables? Just saying. I was getting sacrilegious. Well, the end of the summer came and I got that shiny, bright red Troy-built rototiller out and I dug up the ground, put the garden to bed, as some gardeners like to say. And on one crisp autumn morning, I grabbed my wool jacket and my wool cap and one of our little day packs, and I began to hike up the hill behind my house where I knew there grew a great big old shagbark hickory tree. Shagbark, so named because of the way the bark shags off. Now, if you don't know anything about shagbark hickory trees, they produce lots and lots of nuts. And each nut is contained in a big hull. It's green at first, and then it turns brown. It drops to the ground, and then most of them just split wide open. And if they're not split, they just come right apart with your fingers. But on the inside is a small, cream-colored nut that is as hard as a rock. In order to crack it, you need a big carpenter's hammer and a pair of safety glasses, or a strong bench vise. And once you crack that little nut, you need one of those metal nut picks. They look like a dentist's instrument, and you got to carefully pick out the nut meat. And it takes a long time to get a tiny little handful of nut meat from these hickory nuts. But if you have ever made those German Christmas cookies using shagbark hickory nuts, you'll never want to go back to store-bought walnuts again. And I knew I had a couple of kids at home who would do all that work of taking the nut meat out. So I hiked up to that tree, and I was not disappointed. Thousands of nuts on the tree and on the ground, and it took 2-3 minutes for me to stuff the backpack. I zippered it, and it was bulging. And that's when I decided to sit down for a minute and just relax. So with my back against the giant trunk of that tree, I looked up at the plane going over and all the nuts hanging there. And then I looked at all those nuts that were scattered on the ground, and I just shook my head. I don't know. And then I looked up again. Hello, hey, it's me down here, Ken. I just want to say that if I were you, I would have made these hickory nuts bigger. Wouldn't that make sense? I mean, to make each one of these hickory nuts as big as as big as a grapefruit. Oh, that would be wonderful. And then when they fell, I could pick up a couple of them up and crack one and get the nut meat out easily. I mean, that's what I would do if I were you. Well, I sat there and I just shook my head, thinking about how wise I was. I closed my eyes for a minute just to relax. And as soon as I did, bunk, ow, what was that? I opened my eyes just in time to see one of those hickory nuts bouncing and rolling on the ground. Ow, that hurt. that's when I had one of those things, you know what I'm talking about, an epiphany. If that little nut that hit me on the head had been the size of a grapefruit, at the very least, I would have had a concussion. Well, I sat there and with a sheepish grin on my face, I looked up. Hey, hello, down here. It's Ken again. Well, I just want to say, well, I guess you really do know what you're doing. And you know something? I think that's the truth. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone bless them from below, till the rain comes tumbling down.